Hey everybody! Welcome to the Visiting Artist Lecture Series for Spring 2021. My name is Eileen Rosina and I am a first-year film graduate student. And for more information on this historic program and all of the upcoming presentations, please visit the Art and Art History website. The next lecture in this series will be on March 30th with Simone Lee, and that's at the same time, 6:30 p.m. live on the Art and Art History YouTube channel. This presentation tonight will include an artist talk followed by a short Q&A moderated by me. And throughout the presentation, when questions come up, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Born in Mexico, Miguel Rivera is a practicing artist who has exhibited in Romania, Poland, China, Argentina, Mexico, Japan, and the United States. He holds degrees from the Southern Oregon University in Ashland, the University of Guanajuato, and West Virginia University. His work is collected by museums, university, and private collections. Miguel Rivera has been a visiting artist in Italy, Mexico, Japan, the US, Argentina, China, and Peru. Currently, he is the Associate Professor and Chair of Printmaking at the Kansas City Art Institute in Kansas City, Missouri. His experience as an outsider living in an adopted environment is depicted in his work through disappearing and reappearing layers of signifiers, reinvented through form and color processing, then edited by the deconstructive nature of laser technology. Rivera's work is a progression of manipulated photos and vector drawings, images that are distilled from memories. The materials that he uses serve as metaphors for the passage of time and the human condition. The layering of the surface functions as a contemporary chaotic interpretation, reconstructing, examining, and reinventing memories while drawing on themes of travel, the experience of living in several environments, and displacement. When finished, the final piece serves as a historic record of Rivera's process of exploring, collecting, and creating a visual memory. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Miguel Rivera.
Thank you very much, Eileen. This is a great introduction. I couldn't say it myself even better, but it's here we are, and tonight is I've been looking for this presentation and for this lecture for a year or so. So again, thanks for having me. I also want to thank you for your time and my opportunity, your opportunity to share with me your insights at the end, but also before I need to go through a myriad of experiences that I've been through throughout my life. And then I hope that we all enjoyed this time tonight and then we'll learn something. So full disclosure, I've been in Boulder in Colorado, visiting your program a few times. And so I know the building, I know exactly the passages and the rooms that you live in. So we're all gonna be there at one point, and then I'll be visiting again. So I'll be happy to visit again sometime. So once the pandemic is over. So without further ado, I want to talk to you about my context. What exactly? So my interest in art culminated when I started to attend an associate's degree in printmaking at the University of Guanajuato in my hometown in Mexico. I say culminated because before then, I was set on becoming an engineer. I applied for a scholarship to study in the US, and then I was fortunate to get it. It was like winning the lottery because of the cost that I have to incur into otherwise. Then I transferred to Southern Oregon University in Ashland, where I finished a bachelor's in fine arts, majoring in printmaking with a minor in painting. Right after that, I was admitted to the MFA program at the West Virginia University printmaking MFA, which kind of changed because I actually applied for applied arts, which included the use of computers, and I will go into that later on. But after 2 years and intensive studying and working and teaching, like most of you, I finished the degree in record time, and I was able to go back to Mexico, which was my first and foremost goal, my objective, because I fell in love back with my culture once I went through this 5 to 7 year period of learning art in the U.S. So this is the kind of images that kind of drove me back to my hometown. So being born and raised in a culture that includes a rich history of narrative and ceremonial art, I was able to contemplate religious art around every corner in my native town. So this fact is important on my work since Guanajuato was founded in 1572. Let that sink. After Spanish scouts found silver in the hills of the valley, as colonizers settled through Mesoamerica and Mexico, they used local labor to build Baroque churches with their retablos or interior facades as symbols of power and ownership of the land. Being away from these places for some time made me go back and become another witness, look at them with fresh eyes. I realized that the interesting message these structures convey to any viewer, the beauty of contemplation, wealth, and suffering that Catholic religion instilled in its believers. I was overwhelmed by by the energy, color, and scale. All I can remember was being surprised and enchanted by these images. I fell in love with the elongated compositions of these particular, murals. To me, they convey such a dramatic and dynamic story that made me feel insignificant. I enjoy the specific approach of the muralist movement, like Chavez Morado in this case, and I still sometimes use the elongation of objects to subvert reality. So when I was student in Mexico still, I came across two non-figurative artists, Robert Motherwell, whom you might recognize, and Manuel Felgueres. Back then, I saw studying in art in the US as a way to explore and understand abstraction and leave home. Who doesn't relate to that, right? You're tired of being in your hometown, you want to try something new. So the University of Guanajuato art program prohibited students from making art that look abstract or perhaps influenced by American culture. So there was a tension still, and still is, between our two countries. So it was naive. It was a naive attempt to recreate the nationalistic agenda on muralists from the 20th century and a local Mexican pride education. History has taught me that you may know this, that it's actually the other way around. The early movement of abstract expressionism that was pinned as a trademark of American art was in fact influenced by Siqueiros and Orozco when Siqueiros taught a young Jackson Pollock how to control broad brushstrokes and large scale compositions. So what made me become an artist? After seeing all of this, after being influenced by, American pop culture, I was just perhaps just growing up and living in Mexico, and in such a way it affected my views on society. So I was still looking at, images that they were real instead of being imaginary. So culture and the intertwined life of art and religion became really important. Mexican pop culture, death, and religion coexist in my birth country or in Mexico. As a matter of fact, Andre Breton mentioned that Mexico had invented surrealism when he visited Mexico City and saw children carrying gigantic paper mache puppets to be blown up at a later hour. To be more specific, my views of art evolve around religious art in local churches, the spectacle of suffering in the reenactment of the crucifixion, liturgical acts or religious acts, and artifacts dealing with death. My primary interest during my MFA studies was to use the spectacle to convey respect and spirituality towards death. I have to respect that fact. Being exposed to dead people as a child constantly through images of crucifixes, thorns, painted sculptures with excessive blood stains, and age paint in the form of decay made me pay attention and explore the message of the stained surface as a symbolic element of human condition. And I'm going to pause here because my father owned a funeral service and I was expected to help as even as a young child. My sense of place and mortality was ever present and influenced me to eventually make references to images from churches and from the weather look of stone. So I was 7 or 8 years old, and I was actually helping carrying a corpse to put in a casket. I can see that how traumatic that might have been for anyone, not just me. So that kind of made an impression, and then kind of made me go back to think of the spirituality of actually seeing a dead body, not for the spookiness of it, but actually to the respect of the human condition. So that's what I actually started to think about this, not as a child, but as an adult later on. So my images started to reflect my introspection towards social unrest and the collective anxiety that I started to see during the new wave of violence in Mexico back in 2002. The book, Beautiful Suffering from the Chicago Art Institute, describes how Catholic images are both erotic and violent at the same time. My life in Mexico, in Guanajuato, was also being affected by my need to use drawing as an activity to address my feeling of anxiety from watching TV and reading about violence news or violent news in Mexico, such as execution among cartel rivals. So it was around the time when you heard about people getting decapitated and thrown, their heads being thrown on the dance floors in discotheques and dance dance hall. So that's made a big impression. So I needed to make something with that. So the idea of making these violent drawings came from that idea. So I have mentioned before that I grapple with the idea of spirituality and art. So when I was working on in my MFA and after seeing cultural appropriation by multiple American artists, many referential images have evolved into a series of abstractions from ephemeral experiences, witnessing the sufferings in my memories. Then I saw Michael Tracy's influential works at the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh. To me, it was sort of a revelation because I wasn't looking for cues to reaffirm a belief system, but a pure abstraction through form to convey ideas beyond religion. It became a symbol and a reminder of for my own mortality. These images keep haunting me. They come to me and they may seem fluid and eloquent enough that I have to keep making them. To me, they still represent an act of vented liberation. I keep referring to the fact to similar situations that the Catalan painters felt during the frustrated Spanish political system in the Civil War. In hindsight, I was starting to understand a subliminal form of Mexican spirituality living in the US. Growing up, I was exposed to religious art and architecture mostly. So that was my reference. So I started to analyze form and beauty in facades and altars in churches from the 15th through the 18th centuries. Without knowing, I started to internalize my own judgment between good and bad executions of art. So that was my third art school. Craft became important to observe and appreciate. It wasn't until my grad school years when I started to research artists with similar ideas about religion and the use of the sacred space. Richard Goldberg, for me, represented the latest version of postmodern minimalism while capturing the ambivalence of invocation of Christian beliefs through the carefully arranged lines of symmetry of the spiritual atmosphere. And I mentioned this before with Dennis this morning, so it's one of my idols in terms of form and concept. So my work took a turn after experimenting with transmedia. I was beyond representing a story and a narrative, so I wasn't interested in that. I started to avoid perspective elements, illustrated figures, and traditional Mexican folk art colors. Among my peers in Mexico, this notion of nationalism and Mother Earth imagery was and still is very strong. I thought, like many of us, that I wanted to be myself and not use Mexican cliches or typical images of what represents to be Mexican. So I started to see myself as an image maker with no ties to a specific nationalistic agenda, and as a believer that visual art can be appreciated regardless of race and nationality. So the universality of art. The natural path for this was collaboration. That's why I started a new project called Crossover. And I say I, but actually it was we. Crossover was created by artist Cara J and myself as an experiment in 2004 while Cara J was visiting Mexico. And Cara J is an alum from uh, Boulder, CUB, and she was one of my professors in my MFA classes, and ever since we communicated and started to play like Yves Tanguy from the data movement. So we started to collaborate back and forth, and then she eventually came to Mexico, and so we launched the project officially. Later on, we started Crossover 2012, and this followed uh, with a group of artists that included Patricia Villalobos from Michigan, Melanie Yatsi, your own Melanie Yatsi, Michael Schonhoff from Kansas City, a curator and a printmaker. So we all collaborated at the local residency in Kansas City. Our collaboration started with a roundtable discussion of our personal ideas and themes. We found several points of common ideas and chose specific prints to be added on. So prints or works on paper. So it took a shape of an exquisite corpse. And if you don't know what exquisite corpse, I'll relate that to at the end of the talk. It required artists to trade half finished or started works at the beginning of the residency and allow them to basically be intervened throughout the rest of the week. Once work, property, and egos became irrelevant as we had to trust each other, allowing ourselves and our counterparts to place their hand marks, images, and matrices on one's previous works. So this project has traveled to Argentina, Mexico, Seattle, Kansas City, Bellingham, Washington, and Boulder, Colorado. So you got a glimpse of it a few years ago. Most of our work was completed and exchanged via snail mail and exchanging of the actual works on paper. Each piece made in this series is unique and handmade. These works are not editions. As individual pieces are worked and circulated, there was also no material or size requirement for the work, except that all pieces were on archival paper. That was important. Participant artists agreed to share ownership of an image from start to finish, as one artist should start one piece, another person, artist will finish it. So, and that's how I started to think about how can I change myself, reinvent, because I thought I was getting caught up in this, vicious cycle of making the same thing for 8 to 10 years. So I needed a breakthrough or a writer's blockage. So I use the printmaking studio as a lab where ideas merge and fade. That's very important to me. So the direct contact in the studio, in the shared studio, is simulating where one can share and receive. Project ACE is a model for contemporary expanded media where artists come together to solve problems together. This residency in Buenos Aires was the perfect setting for dialogue of ideas about the otherness and hybrid cultures comparing Mexican and Argentinian identities. We talk about ideas, but we ended up establishing a dialogue about common threats to Latino societies. My residency at ACE was around the time the H1N1 pandemic was still latent in Latin America. So to me, it was significant since it provided firsthand experience to change directions in my own research. I returned to Argentina, invited by the residency director, Alicia Candiani, to co-direct Crossover Argentina chapter. I visited Project ACE in June of 2013. Then I donated several engraved plates to ACE. Images in these plates were part of my personal narrative dealing with invisible threats, social unrest, and a concern towards means of domination. So these plays included images illustrating viruses, geometry used in defense structures, and torture devices, respectively. Primac and Adriano Morachi proposed a collaboration as a call for entries open to emerging and professional artists. Each participant chose on one or two images from pre-printed matrices created by me, leaving them with the challenge to create a bridge between the concept of the original image and the transformations into their own practice. Participants adopted images with an initial conceptual understanding of their cultural experience. Ideas of beauty, environmental imagery were turned into landscape or urban decay by Alejandro Thornton, whereas Sarah Amy Verthi decided to print a similar image to merge the political unrest for unsafe coal and gold mining practices in her native South Africa. Jung Kim deconstructed viral images by locating angles, drawing straight lines between these points, and created geometric structures from the original source. Images were rich and complex since they were all created using different processes, which such as printmaking, drawing, video painting, blind embossing, stencils, and painting. Alicia Candiani was instrumental helping artists to create pieces around or beyond the confinements of process learning and embracing unknown risk to expand the matrix substrate and the necessary approach that embodied the final resort in the form of 2D surface or time-based images. Crossover KCBSA presented artists with options to broaden their own practice. For some, the idea of working in collaboration was a new concept. Others were not familiar with the apparently troublesome willingness to receive images by inheriting my authorship. Initial discussions and closing statements took place via video conferences during 3 months with me in KC and the participants in Kansas City. So having access to a network of artists in the process and willing to take risks is one of the most inspiring experiences to me. I have worked with peers in and outside of my school to launch projects outside of mainstream. Our crossover collaboration started with a roundtable discussion of our personal ideas and themes. We found several points of common ideas and chose specific prints to be added on. I took the shape of an exquisite corpse, I guess. And I always try to find ways to connect these experiences to my own curriculum and a student involvement when possible. So we, as artists, have the responsibility to constantly search for new solutions to common problems. So I was presented with this opportunity to set up an installation at the Nelson Atkins Museums of Art here in Kansas City for the Day of the Dead, the Mexican celebration. So I traveled to Oaxaca, Mexico to source video and images for this project. So going to Mitla reinforced my idea that pre-Columbian cultures like the Zapotecs used abstraction to explain natural phenomena such as death. The idea of death was a necessary transition, even a liberating one that was part of the natural cycle of life. To die was no equivalent to stop existing. It was a way to start a new life. Death in Mesoamerica was divided in several phases equivalent to the 9 levels by Dante's Inferno. A local version of Dante's Inferno would manifest to pre-Columbians while living on Earth. To them, the suffering and discomfort did happen while they were alive. Therefore, death was a relief form, most in the form of the Tezcatlipoca, Mictlan, and Mixtlacihuatl. That's Zapotec for you, so I had to learn that. So it was the place and the god that welcomed those who had recently died. They were allowed to live in this place for 4 years. Finally, at the end of the 4th year, they went to rest with their god. And I have to look at this with a great respect. So I can talk about Octavio Paz, and he has a really interesting quote when he said that Mexicans embrace and celebrate death in comparison with Western culture where nobody talks about it. He says, the word death will burn your lips if you're living in London, New York, or Chicago, but while you're in Mexico, it's part of life. I don't know why I came here, another person said. Mexico is the most surrealist country in the world. Andre Breton, when he finally arrived in Mexico City and realized that he didn't invent surrealism, he discovered surrealism in Mexico. In other words, I wanted to translate the symbolic use of the altar and its abstract interpretation and significance that gave me agency to use abstraction and geometry with specific intentions. I believe that contemporary graphic arts liberated traditional notion of artwork creation. Now we can use computer graphics, integrated photo alternative processes, CNC router, and laser engravers to turn into installation and enhance the sensuality of the surface that supports my images. I also put a lot of work into artisans in the same field, where handcraft is not as relevant and where we discuss the meaning of images more so than techniques. For others, the adaptation and admiration of the beauty that can be found in specific rites of traditions can serve as a source of inspirations. Since rituals play such a vital role in shaping identity, it is only natural that artists depict and represent the rejection, acceptance, and or reverence for the specific rituals that they have been exposed to. I'm not interested in literal depictions. Instead, I take the viewer beyond just a minimalistic portrayal of formal qualities to place of pure raw emotion. So post-digital printmaking or expanded medium has been such that integrates industrial technologies such as offset technology, photomechanical reproduction, like advertising labeling. There are several artists and venues nailing the term post-digital. A recent publication with the same title works in the ever-changing zone where computer technology affects the materiality and where digitally mediated and traditional processes collaborate. So I'm halfway in between. Despite pervasive social and creative virtuality or virtually, the sustained importance of the physicality and tacit knowledge remains. It has been a natural flow of events when I have move into digital technology to recompose and subtract elements in my multi-layer prints. I am using laser beams to engrave or erase photo and drawn images of place and paper with the same ethos of a pointer that wants to cover previous images or mistakes. I have mentioned before that my current statement looks like the role of biology and natural threads plays in the development of cultures of the extinctions or the stages of them. I've always admired the delicate order in the rendition of microorganisms and viruses, especially those that have played a role in the shifting of power. While I was visiting Western Washington University, I was given access to an electron microscope to source local bacteria and viruses. It was a logical decision for a printmaker to integrate the seductive form into my previous half-finished works. I currently use maps, religious icons, and illustrations to describe different layers of meaning, just to be arranged or destroyed, but not to be erased by more layers and laser beams. I'm also altering images from religious architecture for reasons I have mentioned before. I'm very interested in map interpretation and line contour from nautical drawings, especially those that help the Spaniards and Portuguese with the challenges of colonization and power. I am using geometry as a venue to structure chaos and social unrest over disparities. I'm also integrating the idea of the vessel as a construct to restrain multiple images. So this is a sample of how I'm creating a lot of these images. Either I'm drawing directly on the paper or carving onto a plate or using a mill and a woodblock. Then I kept looking back and I agree with the constructivists whose core ideas from early Russian when the movement decided to make geometric art accessible to the common person, to the worker of this franchise to represent a parallel between form and humble principles. I looked around, I realized that I was working with the same set of ideas of technology applications that only a handful of artists were considering using and learning. I took great interest to learn and apply design software and commercial equipment to make images stemming from technology. It made sense to me to use technology to talk about technology when the hand of the artist plays a secondary role. The idea of appropriating the map and replicating it from the source became a form of reporting or storytelling. And then I got more comfortable with my own role in the making process and letting my decisions become more conceptual and less expressionistic. Leonor Cortés Montezuma is a summary of human endeavor, the one of about traveling. So this particular piece is based on colors from the night sky traveling to the Americas from Europe. Leonor Cortés was one of the children from Cortés and his native Indian wife in Mexico. I saw characters like hers as the prototype of the new hybrid culture. Testimony was selected for the 2019 Post-Digital Printmaking Conference in Wrocław, Poland. Throughout this new body of work, historical maps and underlying virus starting to collide, forming new forms. My first thought was to relate the light and the invisible forces that Spanish settlers experienced when traveling to find the New World. I decided to use the imagery, perception of color, and constellation maps to illustrate the invisible energy almost in a similar way described by Richard Turtle. I would like to paraphrase make a quote of him, or quote him, but when he said that his aim was to illustrate the invisible forces that makes us human. The layering of the surface function as a contemporary interpretation. Placing images in these matters helps me to reconstruct, re-examine, and reinvent memories of places and history. Nowadays, my work has been going through a series of techno-revelation. I consider myself a curious person. I learn processes with the intention to share them with others and as tools of vehicles to achieve images or ideas. I'm using completely new technology to make the image I couldn't make before, such as laser engravings, die cutting, etc., or even vinyl stencils. I would like to quote Kerry Chen Marshall when he says that he likes to make art by any available means. He went back to school actually after learning painting, but he had to go back and learn fabric design, printmaking, and such to make this new body of work that he had in mind. So the origins of this idiosyncrasy, it was still around this idea of the mapping and the exercise of power. So maps are intriguing to me because of their sense of truth and the respect that they command. We do not question their validity and embedded information, yet they only consist of lines and text that share a visual syntax that can be read across Western cultures. I'm joining points located in maps relevant to my readings about the history of colonizations of the American continent, Mexico specifically. Eventually, these maps disappear under the action of digital deletion or laser engraving or burning, leaving clean lines on those joined dots. This particular piece is based on colors from produce and raw products taken from the Americas back to Europe, such as red tomatoes, silver colors from silver mines, and brown from potatoes. Background patterns are composite of layers of European viruses brought to the Americas by Hernán Cortés soldiers, nautical maps, and Mexican churches facades, all of them interacting without preconceived order. Virus structures are such that creates a defense mechanisms around itself to form colonies and shield against other organisms. The geometry of some of them is comparable to war forts designed by Leonardo da Vinci, as well as its polyhedras or icosahedral shapes. While bringing viral images to exhibit at ACE in Buenos Aires, I started the conversation about fear of the unknown. The danger that viruses pose is in direct contrast with the microscopic fetishistic appearances. I took a heavy interest in illustration to connections, structures, and dynamics, what makes them a threat, and found similarities with other forms in nature and human creations such as force and warfare. During my research, I found that smallpox brought by the Spaniards killed entire Indian populations, facilitating the conquest at the hand of a handful of soldiers. So that was the biggest weapon. One will never be a prophet in one's land. When you move to a different area, you weigh the consequences of defeating. In the host area, if the host area has similar language and cultural markers, it may not be too difficult to blend in and assimilate. But what happens when the radius is larger and the culture and language are completely different? Do you change your persona to be like the host culture, or make yourself the ambassador of diversity in the local culture? Neither of those options was, viable to me. So I was looking at these images and how they fit in the society that I was starting to live in. So, but on the flip side, living in the US has presented me with a new opportunity to explore themes that I consider more universal or more personal, whatever angle you can think of. I cannot adopt What I cannot adopt is the theme of the border of the recreated Mexican pop identity from LA. So Chicano culture is something that I I haven't embraced. So I don't use it. So instead of that, I have been questioned by Latinos of why I don't embrace, Latino culture. So there is a huge difference between what we consider ourselves. Like, I'm working with abstraction and somebody demands of me to work the other way. So that's what I decided to kind of reinvent the wheel in arts terms, and I decided to move on. So in 2018, I had the opportunity to visit the city of Venice during my sabbatical. So I work as an artist in residence at the Scuola Internazionale di Grafica di Venezia with the challenge to produce a new series that reflected the surroundings of the city. And I have mentioned that I have an interest to find connection between systems and the history of virus. So Venice was the epicenter of the Black Death in the 14th century and the plague in the 16th century, the 1600s, and later on in this as 1575 in between. So they come up with where I became really interested to visit that specific site. In this case, the Salute. So the Salute, or this um, church, was built in the honor of Virgin Mary, thought to be the protector of Venice and Italy, and one of the who saved them from the previous plague in 1575. That attracted me to source multiple shots of its architecture. What the symbolism behind the shape of the building, which to me represented a crown, but it looked more like a fortress, a classical building made out of tremendous marble mass that almost seemed floating on water. All the materials were sourced from abroad, tile by tile. It also represented the wealth that Venice had once in commerce, which was the demise of their constant virus attacks, three of them. I continued to make these works inspired by the uneven and the eclectic street and buildings there. Nothing seemed to be straight, and I really enjoyed that part. So my work turned after experimenting with transmedia. So going back to Kansas City, I was beyond representing a story and a narrative like the muralist. I started to avoid perspective elements, illustrated figures, and traditional Mexican folk art. Among my peers in Mexico, again, they never saw the connection. So I was no longer a Mexican. I started to see myself as an individual without a specific nationalistic agenda, and as a believer that visual art can be appreciated regardless of race and nationality. And I need to visit and recreate the beauty of the past. I still feel like my current work is a result of search of new forms and complex paths embedded in the theory of metaphysics or abstraction from a baseless reality. And I'm borrowing this from Chirico, the Italian painter. I'm reinventing structures and routes that stem from one's daily life, such as maps, the magic of belief, and forces of physics and architectural forms from Baroque church facades. Layers of signifiers appear and disappear as if I'm seeing dormant memories. I started to remember dots in my maps with my daily routines and draw by joining the dots. I became obsessed using the same line over and over as a gesture of an action that followed a routine. The silver color has become a symbol of the element that attracted Spaniards to my hometown. And the colors that follow were reference of the colors that the produce they took to the continent to reinvent Europe in the 1500s. Another recurrent theme in my work is the use of multiplicity embodied in a vessel shape. I like to compartmentalize routes and colors into segments like strata. This strategy allows me to analyze problems with separate hypothetical solutions. I don't have a final image in mind or a master project that I have to follow through. What I have is a general idea of the theme, the sequence of images colliding, and a group of tools that I like to relay to when I'm not sure if the image will be solved successfully. So I have failure. My ratio of success is 75%. It is like the philosophy of Bruce Nauman. You make something every day, even if you don't have clear ideas, the solution will start to appear with constant work. So this work is from the series of expanded media paintings. To me, making images that will be confined to a purest medium didn't make sense. I decided to use forms of printmaking to layer this work on a wooden panel and gave me the format of a painting. So this series of collided images were sourced also from the Italy residence. I subtracted the colors from the Grand Canal there and the totemic chaotic architecture that I learned to admire. Forms and colors were come first to tell my version of my cultural education of being an outsider and slowly adapting to my adopted environment. I'm going to pause here and tell you why I have the need to make these marks. Jose Roca, the artistic director of Filagraphica 2010 actually, nailed the term graphic unconscious to describe the mark or errors we constantly make while typing at the keyboard or while making hand marks. He also goes to the extent to ask audiences to redefine the role of and the importance of print in our collective minds. Furthermore, he and Louis Kamnitzer asked for a referendum to move printmaking as a medium of reproduction and just be a medium for itself, allowing me to make one of a kind. Both conceive the act of print that requires a matrix of a block, a substrate of paper, and the mind of the artist to make these two things marry or collide. A.V. Alpert, another writer, relates the idea of the unconscious back to Walter Benjamin's brief essay titled The Mimetic Faculty. Quote, where he notes that graphology has taught us to recognize in handwritten images what the unconscious of the writer conceals it. So there is a manuscript and you can read somebody else's mind, just not by the words, but the way he or she or they write. So he continues, the idea appears relatively straightforward. Our handwriting reveals elements of our mental life through the form of writing, which doesn't necessarily come across in our words. This act of self-editing these images in a product that resembles questioning of my own values, thus creating a rebirth of the original graphic medium. My mimetic starts when I remove the need to show self gratification. So I'm beyond that, and I remove the substrate. So I'm using this at this point in this piece is the act of describing images directly on a wood or a print or a paint and drawing them, leaving the printing or edition aspect out of the picture. After this short stay in Italy, I collected these images and started to work on them heavily. So drawing to me at this point follows hidden structures and landmarks of experiences that come back to fade away, leaving the graphic nature of contour drawing. I started to appropriate maps, analytical information, and use it in my vector files and milling them directly on my blogs, prints, and papers. This act of liberation allows me to come back and collaborate with the information that I'm given. The creative and sometimes unconscious leads me to to the next step by adding more images or enhancing focal points with color, joining dots and or clusters of colors. So I don't have a step-by-step process to follow through to make this work. They fluctuate from print to laser to carving, back and forth. And this act, it's kind of a byproduct of resembles the questions of my own aesthetic choices and need for assurances. So I'm rebirthing the original graphic medium in my mind. So Margot Lovejoy, and this is important, use the term information as simulation to describe Jean-Francois Lyotard, ideas to dissolve the basic nature of the object into other states of energy. These works aim to be a time capsule of that action. Unlike most of my artist friends, I enjoyed not having a clear path or mental images of what art will look at the end, but I enjoy mostly the process of getting to it more so than the actual finished products. Several artists such as Jasper John, John Cage, or Jorge Luis Borges explain that using these words or explain, enjoying the process of creating the work is more important than the actual work itself. So I'm going to go quickly because I know we're running out of time, but facades in this case have a way to make images in 2D. So I started this project with a musician friend, a collaboration, and what we did is recreated the Oregon Trail from Westport, Kansas City to Walla Walla, Washington, and I engraved the path of the river that Oregon Trail followed, and then created a synergy that from the human path. So and he went took these images and then turned them into music. And so we have a joint effort right there. Going back to 2D, so I burned my drawings of a property engravings from Durer using the laser CNC, and I started to draw the Samson rending the lion combined with the city of Cannaregio, Venice, and started to make these, slashes and pendulum-like lines to replicate the energy that I think Durer was thinking of. And that turned into this giant show and the biggest so far in Kansas City back in 2019 with 40 pieces, I think, but these are the biggest ones. So after 3 years of working as a resident at Studio Sinks, my work have evolved into a time travel that includes familiar maps, historic architecture, hidden geometry, and above all, an invisible energy of human migration patterns. Now I use my own route patterns or places that I have visited. Art is giving me a chance to revisit my experiences and find forms where I can see before. Where I am right now is I'm working on another project called In Between with Tara Sabarwal from India and also residing in New York City. What I can tell you is that I found myself after this travel to Venice that I'm perfectly fine living in limbo. I'm no longer a typical Mexican nor a true American. I'm somewhere in between. I'm an artist who's working on ideas that help me to interpret my surroundings and the purpose of art making. I would like to include to revisit the visiting historical images of power and subjugated pre-Columbian cultures is to me has been revealing. I like to reclaim ideas that represent the simplicity of form and abstraction as a human expression instead of a Western dominance. How can I accept the fact that even amongst Latinos, there are big differences when it comes to variation within Spanish and Indian indigenous cultures among each country? These differences are also affected by economic opportunities and racial colorism among countries and social strata. I see a division between neighborhoods, classes, and races in different countries. I have visited and they have similar problems, yet the surroundings still have a way to influence my work at an unconscious level. So thank you for your time, and then ready to take calls or questions.
Thank you so much, Miguel. That was just incredible. What a career you've had, and it's just incredible to see the work. I'd like to start off with a question. We already have a bunch of questions coming in, but I wanted to kick us off and just ask about this. I feel like your work is such an interesting conversation of the control of the laser and like the mark of your hand. And I totally understand what you mean when you say like it's in a liminal space. Like with all these additions and erasures, like how do you know when a work is complete? What is that process like for you?
Well, I can tell you that sometimes it's difficult to stop because when I look at the form, to the comment from a very formal art education in which you look at shape, form, balance of values, and then I know that the work has to have a way to stand on its own visually first and foremost. But even when the image, it feels like a complete, like well balanced range of values, like from dark to light values, from complexity of the simplicity of the background versus the foreground, how it looks. It's a matter of taste, right? It's your sense of design, his kicks in high gear, just like I like to quote humor when he says, when you're a basketball player last season as Michael Jordan, you don't think about it, you just react. And then when I have a way to look at the image and say, well, this is quite done, but it doesn't have the elements that I want to include, then I take it back. And then instead of taking it to the laser, I might take it to the additive process of, dropping another layer to compose or recompose the image. So um, some of these images, they have 12 steps or 12 layers of printing and editing and printing and editing again. And it got to the point that I think three of them, I have to mount them onto another piece of paper so they will hold. So it's like they take a lot of brutality in a sense. I'm really abusive with paper, and then that kind of gives me that freedom to say that I'm just representing something that I'm thinking of. And John Cage at one point he set his prints on fire, and then that was a liberating act because kind of pushing the idea that you were not attached to objects. So your mind expressing a thought, and then thought is represented the colors and lines. In this case, I can tell you that my success ratio is 75%. The other 25%, I should have stopped at one point, and I didn't.
That's incredible. There's such a history in each piece. It's fascinating. Okay, well, I better get to some of these great questions that have been pouring in. I'll start off with one from Delara. She asks, would you say being introduced to communities from multiple cultures has influenced your work? If so, what did you gain from these experiences?
Great question. I've learned that I have to be humble. I have to learn that I don't have all the cards in the game, and I have to give agency to other people to give me their honest opinion. Not all of them are artists. They shouldn't they be? But I learned a lot just from by listening, and I'm trying to like give some voice to all of these people that I've met across. They're not visible in my works, but I collected in my books, in my photographs, in my computer. So I was, when the occasion arises, I give them credit for some of the ideas that they've given me, either directly or indirectly in my work. So yeah, they have changed me, and I realized, I came from a country where I thought that we were the center of the world. Now we're in the center of the world. If you go to China, what I've been is they're the center of the world, so they're not right and wrong. So we're just different, and I have to honor that.
Absolutely. Thank you. I was also curious, Audra asked, I was going to ask this as well, your interest in microorganisms and viruses. So we just are dying to know how the current pandemic and COVID, if that's had any influence on your work or will in the future.
Yeah, it probably will because I remember coming across the 2010 2011, I think that's when I went to for the first time to Argentina, and then I realized that I had to disclose my medical history because being Mexican, they were really suspicious of bringing the virus to Argentina. So that kind of led me to really think about these invisible threats that I was talking about, and how can you give shape, form, color to this threat. So obviously photography was the first resource that I can think of. If I can illustrate a virus, something that we can see, maybe we can give it at least a face to a threat. And then so I started to read more about the history of viruses, and then went back to Italy. That's how I ended up there, before the pandemic hit. So I can see how the virus will appear again, but right now it's overly used that it will be almost like too much, like to taking advantage of the situation to make war about that. I will let it rest,
Mm-hmm.
let it resonate, think about it, and probably in 2 years I will, go back to that idea.
Yes, we need some objective distance from this situation for sure. Well, we're all looking forward to seeing where you take that in the future. I want to ask this question from Eve, and you mentioned earlier you've done quite a bit of collaboration, and how that can kind of break bad habits in your practice or just kind of monotony. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And Eve asked, does it introduce new ideas into your work that you haven't thought of yet, the process of collaboration?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like any artist, and writers, hit a wall at one point when you feel like you're beating the same dead horse. And well, when I think you need to reach out to a group of artists that you trust, and either the same group or the same career level, and be honest with them and tell them what you want to do, and then also be open about the fact that you're in this conundrum trying to exercise your education is in an extended way, so you will keep learning. And then that's when I say, I'm an artist, but I consider myself still a student of life. So if you don't mind, we'll collaborate, and if you don't mind, I will pick your brain and borrow some of your solutions for myself. So that's the true collaboration, because I'm willing to give, and they have to be willing to give themselves to me as well. And I can tell, like, there are three big instances for previous collaboration that kind of helped me through some of my own ideas. And I've told them, like, thank you for your time. This the feedback that you gave me at one point really helped me go through this. And I think that like being honest and being open to uh, people's ideas and how you perceive them and cherish them, I think they really enjoy that. And if you have that trust, I think they're most likely they will share that with you as well.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe just a couple more. There's so many good ones. Thank you guys for asking all of these great questions. But Simon asks, your work reminds me so much of the work of Kandinsky. Do you take inspiration from Cubist work at all?
Actually, I'm going to go back. Kandinsky is kind of the middle of the road, because I thought that same thing. I was looking at Rodchenko, Kandinsky at one point, but before then, when I went back to Mexico, I realized that the pyramids in Carcasla and Oaxaca and Mitla at the Great Temple, they use geometry and abstraction as in a similar way as the constructivists, as Kandinsky. So they use, shapes. So they attracted, elements of like, seashells or thunderstorms or flora, fauna, and jaguars to, and idolize in such a way that made these stylized forms. And when you look at them, they don't look like they look in nature anymore. They are beautiful attraction. And then when you compare them with Kandinsky and Rodchenko side by side, they have the same shape, different objective, right? The pre-Columbian cultures, they have this idea of to use art to connect to the afterlife. So that's what I was talking about in while visiting Mitla, Mexico.
Wow.
So thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right, well, we're just about in an hour, and I think we just want to ask maybe one more question, and this one just came in from Dennis. He writes, map imagery is important in your work. Can you talk about art itself as a mapping or model of the world around you?
Mapping is such a Western thing, and map is an illusion, but also it's a construct basically without a land to attach to map doesn't have any meaning, right? And I like to refer to the idea of mapping from the Native American cultures because Navajo, if I'm not mistaken, they have a way to teach mapping to the young. And then what they said, they travel, but they don't use a physical map, so they have to look back every 100 yards to remember the way back. So mental mapping is the other thing that I keep thinking, how can we don't have to use the Western idea of the maps, and we can use the illusion of maps and the way to direct, abstraction.
I love it. Thank you, Miguel. Well, let's call that a night. You've been so generous with your time and presentation, and we so look forward to the day where you can come to Boulder, to campus again, to visit us there.
Will do. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and thanks for being here.